Hey, and welcome to our third edition of Novel Solutions for Novel Times. And we're from the Retail Blockchain Consortium. And today we're going to talk about the new behaviours and the impacts from the latest sort of pandemic and the supply chain issues we've seen over the last probably 2 or 3 months. And I suppose the interesting thing is now thinking and listening to what's happening in the world is, are we moving to a deglobalized world or a decentralized world, or actually are we moving to a centralized world? So the guys on the call will sort of start to talk about that. But first of all, UCL and Nikhil has actually done some preliminary research around blockchain and supply chain companies, and there's a few little nuggets they've found so far. So I'm going to hand over to Nikhil just to give us a few high-level understanding of this research that's just been done.
Sure, thanks, Antony. So this is part of some of the work we were doing to update the Retail Blockchain Consortium sort of report that we did last time, updating it for 2019 and 2020. One of the kind of research questions we looked at was, has COVID-19 actually changed the adoption of blockchain? Has it accelerated it? What's going on with these companies in the supply chain world? And I should add that these are some very early findings, and they need to be, checked a bit further before they'll be published. But essentially, sort of the top things we're seeing is that these blockchain companies have not really repurposed the tools that they're looking to apply to supply chains, but they're using sort of COVID-19 as an advertising platform for why they should just be adopted in this sense, right? So it's not like there are new solutions about, okay, this is effectively going to help with COVID-19, like for instance, immunity passports, but they're just saying that these are more important, like blockchain technology is going to help with COVID, with the solution it has. That's one thing. The other we've seen is basically that other companies are essentially offering kind of price discounts, on adopting their technology. Some are repurposing a little bit what they're doing into remote working technologies. So not only applying in supply chain, but to other kind of domains as well. And finally, there's a lot of actually, we've seen that there's a lot of sharing occurring, i.e. companies are publicizing other companies that may be sort of that have solutions that are useful and looking to take on partnerships. So it's kind of a little bit mixed in this sense. I mean, the kind of key thing that we saw is there's not been a tremendous amount of new kind of blockchain solutions developed specifically for COVID, but COVID is being looked at as something that blockchain that existing solutions can apply to, and certainly that there's a lot more marketing going on from companies about deploying their solutions to help with COVID.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because during the crisis, it's been a lot of discussions, a lot of research and discussions has happened around, it's now time for DLT and blockchain to start to be used more, especially around trusted, immutable, shared data, etc., and how it brings, ecosystems together, and obviously supply chain being one of the biggest, most complex global solutions. So I think that's sort of really interesting how that's starting to come together. But if you look at the new behaviours, has that just been a marketing discussion? Have lots of people talked about it, and now things have, let me say, stabilised? I know things are still, the world's still in a mess, but it seems to be a little bit more stable at the moment. It seems to me people are just ignoring it now and going, oh, let's carry on back to what we used to do. No, do you see in any of this that are behaviours changing? Are things being adopted, or was it just a discussion for the first few weeks and now it's back to business as usual?
I think that was always the fear, Anthony, from those that were probably advocating change of some form. Yeah, I fear that the rest of the world thinks that we've now sort of hit peak pandemic. We're probably on the long tail and potentially going to go back to some degree of whatever normal was before. Yeah, the challenge is that I fear that the interest that we saw initially, and coming back to what Nikhil was saying, I think he's absolutely right in terms of what their findings are, that companies were beginning to sort of repurpose or repackage from a marketing point of view the technology, but addressing fundamentally some of the issues that were always there underlying. What coronavirus does and the COVID pandemic has done is actually amplify a lot of those challenges, and rightly so to some extent. It was used to flag those sort of shortcomings prior, but now that they're feeling that the supply chain maybe has sort of handled it okay, the areas where it was always underperforming are now sort of going back to the, well, that's in the too difficult to address box.
Yeah.
So the pattern of behavior is, it's I guess it's, your neural networks are wired to behave in a certain way. If you've been conditioned to behave in a certain way for years, decades, then to go back to that and to know what you know and feel comfortable in is probably the default. And I feel that's what people are beginning to do. So it's a case of how do we keep the world's attention on what needs to be addressed. And I think some of that is being done, in all fairness to some governments. They are now talking about decentralizing or deglobalizing. There are challenges around that. We've kind of spoken off camera a little bit about that just a few minutes ago. Yeah, I fear that if we don't keep sort of bringing the attention of the world to the fact that these challenges haven't gone away and will potentially come back and impact us again if and when there is potentially a second wave.
And Peter, from a customer perspective, because obviously they're the end user of the supply chain, what do we think's happening there? What's it looking like now and in the future?
I think it's an important question. And if we look at the impact on the consumer itself, and in particular as a shopper, the effect on retail, I mean, the early hoarding and everything else and the initial challenges in the supply chain were one thing. But now that it's sort of settling down, we're beginning to see some real differences in the behavior of the consumer. Far more use of the online shopping and perhaps not returning in a hurry to the traditional visit your local supermarket type activity. But I think the other consequences are far broader than that. And it's starting looking at, for example, the ranges of products on the shelf. If you take the example of milk, one particular major milk provider was providing 16 different products, is now providing 4, right? It's a lot more cost effective to just limit your business to doing 4 simple products. So all of this range proliferation that's been going on for decades, it to some extent isn't necessary. So the question is going to be, to what, if you've doubled the percentage of people doing e-commerce shopping instead of visiting a store, that's got a long-term impact. And the cost implications of that, if you look at the doubling of delivery slots for e-commerce, the cost implications of that, that's literally not profitable to be actually delivering the individual products to the consumer. So the whole cost model has got to be relooked at. The cost for the additional supply chain capacity, the additional drivers, trucks, and the like, but also the pickers in the store. So the whole cost model is being broken, despite the fact that the volume of sales is increasing.
And in terms of the smaller ranges, what impact? Because obviously online that doesn't make an impact in terms of the front end, obviously, but through the supply chain and in physical stores, that's going to be a massive impact if we reduce.
Yes. And I think, well, take it back to the context of the high streets and the decline of the high street anyway.
Yeah.
If the so-called anchor stores no longer justify the widest ranges, it's an accelerating impact, unfortunately. So where it's going to lead remains to be seen.
Yeah.
To an extent, we'll rebound to where we were, but we won't get fully back, right? And the world's moved on.
I've got a question, Peter, for you.
Sure.
So in that, what you've just described, interesting. One of the challenges, we know only too well within healthcare and pharmaceuticals is this. Forgive me for using the phrase as well, but we've always spoken about flattening the curve of the bullwhip, and it's hugely problematic. The cost of having an extra packet of pills on a pharmacy shelf. As it ripples through, if every pharmacist does that, costs a lot of money. The numbers of transit vans, and I think the pharmaceutical industry is probably to blame for the huge amount of CO2 emissions that all the transit vans that move around the planet as a result of drugs being moved from pharmacy wholesaler, or vice versa, rather. What are your thoughts on that? Are you saying that we can actually see an improvement in efficiencies along that whole?
Well, we're going to have to, if we're going to keep going in the current direction, see some substantial improvements. And it's hard to see, particularly for the smaller retailer, how that's going to work. In your pharmacy scenario, we're enjoying deliveries to the house of our pharmaceuticals, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, in terms of medicines being dropped off, but that's prohibitive in an ongoing sense. So things have got to change, and I think it'll be a little while before that one settles down.
It seems as though we're moving from just in time to just nearby. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the south of England in the UK, and around the M25, there's thousands now warehouses. Some of the big guys, obviously Amazon's, etc., but some of the normal high street retailers because of online. And so, is it not that the high street physical presence, which had a big stock room, has now just moved outside, the big cities, to where the land's a bit cheaper and you're near the connected networks, and they're bigger, so they can hold more stock there. They can have a buffer of stock for the online, but also a buffer of stock for whatever the high street lives. Is that sort of starting to happen more now?
I think that's all part of the equation. To what extent we see a store becoming more of a click and collect location for localized distribution remains to be seen. But I think it also goes back to, by the way, trying to source more locally as well. Right? There's an increased desire, to eat local produce rather than have stuff shipped around the world, partly for sustainability reasons, but actually in this current climate, there's an increased focus on that. And I think it all ties back to that question of food safety and traceability in the supply chain. And a lot of that comes back to trust, which brings us back to the technology again, right?
Exactly.
There's a role for blockchain in addressing that.
It is. It very much, blockchain is immutable, trusted transactions. It can tell you where things are from. And an interesting question for you, Nikhil, then. So are we centralizing, decentralizing, deglobalizing, or what? Because it's actually quite a mix, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's both in a sense, right? Like initially, as the world globalized, it decentralized from relying on individual countries or suppliers in one place to going to many different suppliers, but increasingly because of cost pressures, right? That has become itself much more centralized, even I would argue even more centralized than it was before, because there's only a few key places in the world, perhaps that certain resources or certain, like you've said before, Naj, certain chemicals are only sourced from certain countries in the world, right? Or one particular country. So in that sense, the supply chains have become so much more centralized than they were before. But I think going forward, what we'll be seeing is that unwinding into a kind of a decentralized, centralized kind of model, in the sense that if we do say, okay, the UK should be self-reliant on, say, certain key drugs, for example, and the chemicals required to manufacture them, we should be careful that it's not centralized in the sense that there should also be resilience within the United Kingdom, for instance, on these particular things that we need, right? So in that sense, I think the point that you make, Antony, which is about looking to produce locally, right, rather than thinking about it in terms of like where is it available within the entire UK, perhaps having say several different regions within the UK that are able to produce something, at least ensures that if we are going more centralized in that sense, there is still an element of decentralization, a resilience that is built in. And that's the key, really. It's how can we improve resilience, right?
And I think it's a complete oxymoron, this with blockchain technology, because blockchain technology is, to everybody's intents and purposes, is decentralized, and everybody talks about it being decentralized, but actually it is fairly centralized and fairly controlled. And once people start to understand that, it's the same as using a centralized system, just with more participants, more information shared, but actually it's still centralized. And I think over the last few years of doing many blockchain projects, you realize that this is, it's not decentralized versus centralized. It's about the truth and transparency. and showing the information in a more efficient way. That's sort of the critical parts. So if you look for different behaviours, for new behaviours that people should really be thinking about, I think there's two sides to this. One, the consumers need to act, think, behave differently, and the businesses on the other side need to act, think, behave differently. So Peter, from a customer point of view, what behaviours do you think will appear over the next few months and years?
Well, I think there's going to be more interest in the, if you go back to supermarkets for a second, in the cheaper end, the Aldis and Lidls of this world. We're starting to eat the lunch of the major supermarkets by coming in with a more limited range, but a more aggressive pricing strategy.
Yeah, so the discount that are globally, where they have a very limited range, maybe 3,000-4,000 items, versus a big supermarket or a Walmart, which could have 100,000. It's more of those smaller, and again, they'd be local as well, wouldn't they? Most of those are more local.
And if the pattern follows like in America, with 40 million more people now claiming the unemployment benefit, there's going to be an increased number of people with a limited budget to spend. So it's going to impact the whole sort of shift in the shape of that market, and make it more cost oriented. Ideally, value at the same time as cost. It's not quite the same thing.
Yeah, but isn't the problem with this then? Retailers can't do that. You can't have your cake and eat it. So you can't have lower prices and source them in a more disjointed way. Or maybe the solution is to implement blockchain technology, and then you can have a global centralized, decentralized network, but you're managing the authenticity and the efficiency through blockchain technology.
And I think that's going to be an interesting area that we haven't seen take off as yet, but it clearly fits with the future direction, and it's something we need to keep watching.
And Naj, from a businessy supply chain sort of business point of view, what should they be thinking of looking at doing next, behaviour-wise?
For me, I think recognizing that you do need to start looking to your partners. If we're dealing in situations where we want to try and build resilience, then scarce resources is something that we're going to have to share. And this concept of wholly sort of thinking of yourself and being and I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be sort of concerned about market competitiveness and your own IP, but the reality is that if the pot is only so big from which you can draw from, then to make sure that we do all get a chance at doing what we do best, we need to be able to cooperate in that competitive landscape. And I know it's a slightly hackneyed phrase of competition, but that's the sort of thing that we need to be talking about.
I think you're right. I think it's critical, and with DLT, it's a technology, but helping behaviours, blockchain helps drive sharing behaviour with consortiums, ecosystems.
Absolutely.
Again, the successful projects that you see out there are projects that work together globally. I don't mean blockchain projects, just the world works when people work together. We've seen that many times. I think, unfortunately, the world seems to be trying to split apart too much, and hopefully we can start to, as supply chain and retail businesses start to work together more. Finally, Nikhil, what thoughts would you have around behaviours and sort of next stage of this?
Well, I mean, certainly, as well as supply chains and what may change with those. I think the key thing is what we discussed a bit earlier, is actually how much of this change will really actually happen, right, going forward. And certainly if we look at the world and what's out there, and especially the stock market, it's like as if things are even better than they were before, right? Which is a total difference to the reality that we're actually seeing on the ground. Yeah. So, I mean, that remains to be seen, really.
I think it's, sorry, go on then.
No, I just, there's a lot of, the other point I'd add is there are, I mean, again, as Peter said, it remains to be seen how much change we'll see in supply chains with new kind of, with the utilization of blockchain. I mean, there is a lot more in terms of even, the World Economic Forum, Harvard Business Review, etc. More and more pieces are coming out now about this COVID now is the time to switch to blockchain, but will that actually occur? And that remains an open question.
I think you're spot on. I think the blockchain and other technologies will obviously help the new world immensely, and whatever the new world is. And it doesn't matter whether it's COVID or not inspired, or the catalyst, should I say. Blockchain technology is about sharing, trust, and that side of it. If we don't trust each other as companies, as humans, as governments, and you just need to look at the press to know whether there's trust or not. I'm not going to say anything more, but you need to bring in trust. And I remember when I started this, 4 or 5 years ago, and I used to call blockchain electronic trust, and people used to go mad at me and say, that's disgraceful. You can't replace trust with technology. Well, reality is you can give certainty on the data and the relationship between A and B, that it does help deliver more trust. So I think it's really important that people do not just say, yeah, it's really interesting, this blockchain, it's great, it could help, couldn't it? They actually do go out there and start to work on projects and actually start to work together to do this, rather than, I don't want this to be lip service, it needs to be action. And I think, let's hope that some of your early findings, Nikhil, are sort of, we can find a bit more of where people are starting to get into things and working together. And, we have to adopt this. We have to start growing this. The time is there for us to do this. So I think people just need to get out there and start working with DLT, blockchain, and other technologies to build a better world, especially around our supply chains. Anyway, on that, any more comments from you guys? You're going to look blank, you always do.
No, we're with you on that, Antony.
Looking forward to Nikhil's report as and when it comes out, because that should be an interesting update.
Yes,
absolutely.
We'll share it on the website. But thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for your time, and we'll do another one of these soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Take care, guys. Bye.